Being Black in America comes with its challenges. However, we understand that enlightenment through education is the oppressor's worst fear. By bridging the gap between academia and the people, our purpose is to equip you with knowledge that breaks down barriers during your journey towards truth and freedom. Welcome to the Black and Highly Dangerous Podcast.
Yo, Daph, what's going on? What's going on?
Nothing much. Just, trying to settle into the rhythm of the semester and the fall and all that good stuff. How about you?
Same old, keeping busy. So as we mentioned last time, with our kind of welcome back episode, this is one of the first episodes of our new format and going in to the rest of this year, moving forward. And of course, we'll keep you all updated with that. But as we mentioned before, this will be our first kind of, book review type episode, taking a new direction, trying out some new things. And so today's book will cover nonviolent stuff that get you killed. And this book is, well, I guess I should also say the author's name, who is, let me pull it up, Charles E. Cobb Jr. And it talks about how guns made the civil rights movement possible. There's a lot of conversation going on today about firearms and the Second Amendment in so many different directions. And so this book crossed my path with a recent project that I'm working on. And so I thought, hey, this would be a good opportunity to discuss this kind of perspective of, firearms in the Black community, and also how or if they were even impactful in the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I was really excited to read this book when you recommended it, Tyrell, because it's just not something that I even thought about, like guns within the context of the civil rights movement, completely new take on things for me. So thanks for the recommendation.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. And this was given to me by some of the gun folks I've been interviewing. This book has come up several occasions when kind of asked what they're reviewing or what do they read about when it comes to Black firearm ownership. And this one is one of the more popular ones that has come up. So I was like, yeah, let's have a discussion on this and add this to the conversation. Because like I said, it's something that has not been on our radar historically when we think about the civil rights movement. So I guess before we dive into the book, we can spend a little time talking about what our perceptions were about firearms in the Black community before reading this book and, its relation to the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. For me, so you just mentioned two things, like firearms in the Black community and then firearms as it relates to the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I had two different perspectives on that. Mm-hmm. I'm from the South. And so most Black people I know from the South are largely okay with guns. Like my daddy, had just too many of them. And he quick to flash it. I mean, not in a threatening way, but I don't know. He just got this kind of thing with guns. He just like them. I am the most liberal person in my family, the only one who probably talks about gun control and stuff like that. And so when I think about Black people and guns, it is just, I think about it as a part of Black folks are Southern too. And I think guns are just a Southern thing and Black people are not exempt from that. Mm-hmm. So I think that was my perspective on Black people and guns. Mm-hmm. Now I don't see Black people as mass shooters and they're going to shoot up anything, but we keep them in our homes. We have them. We enjoy them. It's a part of the culture. Mm-hmm. Now, for the other thing you mentioned, guns in the civil rights movement, it's not something that I thought about at all. It just, beyond maybe thinking about radical, Black thought towards the late 1960s. I think there was the only thing related to civil rights movement that I think of guns, I think about the Black Panthers taking over the Capitol in California, but that being a very event that was more of an outlier. Mm-hmm. when I think of the civil rights movement, I think of nonviolence. There's like, there was this like t-shirt of these quotes going around in the last couple of years, like, I'm not my ancestors, to kind of like suggest like they might not have bopped you upside the head if you did something, but I will.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that is like the general perception of the civil rights movement. Nonviolence, I'm going to turn the other cheek when you slap me type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess, and after reading this book, which I'm sure we'll get to in a little bit, I think those approaches or those t-shirt slogans are probably also incorrect, because I think they add to the narrative
Very.
add to the misconception and the narrative that Black folks were kind of docile and complacent in these movements. But yeah, similar to you, well, I guess a little different, right? Because thinking about Black folks and firearms, because you're a Southern gal and I'm a Northern boy, and so growing up in the Northeast, for sure, guns were not something that's regular. Guns were not normal, because of the restrictions and the amount of gun laws we have, New York and New Jersey, which have changed over these past few months. We were just normal. It was normal to not have guns. It was abnormal to actually know people who had guns or see guns around. So I come from a different, complete, almost opposite culture, where my father, he's been involved in law enforcement, so I knew he knew how to use guns. I know he had them for his job, but we never even saw them. He kept them hidden away from me and my brothers, and never had really much discussions of them and stuff like that. So guns was foreign to me growing up, and I think my association with them typically would be either police or folks who were having guns illegally and doing bad things or committing crimes was kind of my approach with folks with guns. But there was no hunting, so yeah, it was different. And so I never really thought about it like, oh, Black folks can have guns, or maybe we should have guns for whatever particular reasons. It just never crossed my mind. And then definitely with the civil rights movement, nonviolence always took priority when we talked about the strategies used to combat white supremacy. But I never, and then I think, like you said, Black Panther Party for sure, that, popular image of Malcolm X, like holding a shotgun over his shoulder, like kind of looking out the window, and so it was almost like competing ideologies, like one's nonviolent, one's violent, which wasn't the case. But I think thinking of them together with the overlap wasn't really a part of the narrative of when I thought about Black history. And I think, this book definitely sheds light on how there was a lot of overlap, even with folks that I was surprised to hear about, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so, yeah, it was just always kind of distant, two competing things, not together. Although I did recognize that the sentiment, the goals were the same of, protecting Black life and moving us forward, and the strategies were a little different. But I didn't think that as the I guess more successful strategy, or a strategy that we needed, because that's all we hear, which also I have questions about as well, thinking about this book and thinking about what we've learned about the history. Is like, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but is there a reason why that nonviolent approach was, I guess, propagated more than the other approach of using, weapons to protect your community? And I think there's something to that, of why maybe, white folks and other folks will push that narrative more than saying, hey, Black folks also armed themselves and it was equally effective to get our missions across. So I think there's something to that as well, as far as when we talk about how we learn our history and maybe why we learn our history a certain way. I think that there was some intent why that part was missing in that messaging.
Oh, absolutely. So how I mentioned the Capitol, when the Black Panthers took over the Capitol, and that was when the NRA was working with the government, okay, we need some stricter gun laws and some registration. You get what I'm saying? Hey, I don't know if there's anything scarier than a Black person with a gun.
Yeah. To the white folks, yes, that is one of the most scary things I'm sure they can imagine. and what they're most fearful of, I'm sure. And I think that's why we see a lot of overlap. You know, I know not every white person who has a gun is like white supremacist, and some do it for sport, hunting. But I think that's also the imagery here where we commonly see, especially with popular media and politics, that is a strong correlation, I would say, between the two. And a part of it is not worried about so much about the government, but it's about, losing power. And those weapons, I think, represent power to them. And I think it represents something different for Black folks, as we will see shortly. But okay,
Absolutely.
any other thoughts coming to mind before reading the text?
No, I think that's, between both of us, I feel like that kind of sums up like how I thought about things beforehand.
Okay. So let's dive in to nonviolent stuff that get you killed. I think just the title of the book is definitely one that draws attention for sure. And it's definitely from a quote within the text. I forgot who said the quote, but it was somebody.
I think they said Turnbull.
Yeah, Turnbull, I believe. Yeah. Said the quote where he pulled it from. And it kind of sums up, just the thought about what was happening and transpiring. The author wrote this book essentially to do what Daphne and I talked about, is that share that part of civil rights movement, how Black folks taking up arms was a very important part of our success, a very important part of the civil rights movement that goes undiscussed. And so he just told a lot of different stories in a lot of different ways, pretty much in every kind of era, every kind of situation of Black folks fighting for freedom. Firearms were a part of that in some capacity. It was like never a time where it was just complete nonviolence. And I think that's an important story to tell, because I think it kind of reshapes the way we think about firearms in the Black community moving forward. That the Second Amendment right, although it's very clear that this was not meant for us, and Black folks were still barred from having firearms early on at the inception of these, this country, the Constitution, and these laws. And as you mentioned, even when Black folks were allowed to have firearms, folks like the NRA were trying to create laws to make sure we didn't have firearms. So I also think that we think about it this way too, because I think it's just embedded in our history of like, oh, Black folks should not have firearms. And the nonviolence movement, I think, also propagates that some more. Black folks should not have firearms. We should be nonviolent in our struggle and take this approach. But then we see pretty much in every era how violence has been, pushed onto our communities through white supremacy, whether it's through slavery, whether it's through police and law enforcement, whether it's through white supremacist groups, et cetera. Just everywhere we turn, in every era we turn, in every generation, there's tons of examples of us being victims of racialized violence in some way, shape, or form.
No, absolutely. One thing I really appreciated about the book is that it does a good job of introducing us to, I feel like, actors in this movement who were on the ground, whose names aren't as widely known and discussed. It kind of like turns away from like our charismatic leaders and voices that were like largely at the center and introduces us to people like Hartman Turnbull, who, we just mentioned, told Martin Luther King that the nonviolent stuff ain't no good. It'll get you killed. And just for a little context, Hartman Turnbull was one of the first African Americans to attempt to register to vote in Mississippi, along with a group called the First 14. So just a little background and context. What's interesting about this book is that it is a mixture of like memoir and historiography, like giving us all of that background context. And thinking about like what I took away is like how nonviolence as an approach was largely possible because there were a lot of like individuals and groups who were willing to bust back, like, and protect the human lives of those who were willing to be nonviolent.
Yeah, no, that's a big part of it. And one thing too, because I know you mentioned, folks who we haven't heard of as much, but I think was even surprising to me was folks that we did hear about trying to take up arms, like Martin Luther King, right? He actually went in to apply to get firearms, but because of who he was and who had the power to give those permits, they denied him the permits. And so what was happening is that other folks, he apparently had weapons in the home because, he had things happening and folks trying to attack his family, but they weren't his. It was like roundabout way of other folks getting him in their name and then lending them to him so he can protect his home. Even W.E.B. Du Bois.
The
one story, he pretty much says something along the lines that, he gonna have someone's guts on the ground if they come and try to attack his family with his shotgun, protecting his home. So it's even like these figures, intellectual figures, these folks who were in front of the nonviolent movement, these big names, actually went and got arms to protect themselves. And that's something like we never hear about when we talk about these movements.
Absolutely. It's interesting, the author, Cobb, who was, so I mentioned that it's like kind of like memoir. Well, for our audience, Cobb was a former field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is often referred to as SNCC. And, having these on the ground experiences and like, he was there and actually talking about how he ended up in Mississippi on his way to Texas to like do these workshops, related to, I guess, like racial injustice, and like somebody like challenging him and like, well, this is where the action is happening. Like, why are you like going somewhere else? And, it was through this organizing that they realized just how at danger they were, how they were potentially, putting local people at risk, and that armed self-defense was just them exercising, the most basic human rights. Like they are trying to live. And like the whole idea that like nonviolence was this Gandhian crusade, that's just not what it was. Nonviolence was a tactic. I think there's a quote, it said, "The principal militant dignity of nonviolent resistance." It won national sympathy for the idea of extending civil rights to Black people, but that wasn't necessarily like a principle that people were like living out. Like, I think it was a quote that was like, they believed in nonviolence while also cleaning their rifles because they want to live just like anybody else.
Yeah. I think the approach was like, listen, we're not here to antagonize or to provoke. We're just here to protect. We're here to not be violently victimized. And so we will take up these arms. And literally the reason why we're supposed to take up these arms is self-defense, that we're going to peacefully protest. We're going to exercise our rights, but we're going to also make sure that no one comes and harms our community. And versus, I think the other ideologies that, Black folks have arms, narratives, they're coming to take us or coming to attack, but that's just never been the case. And I don't even think that's the case today, why a lot of Black folks have arms. And a lot of the Black folks I've been talking to, it's just simply to say, hey, white folks out here getting crazy, and if they come and try me, I will be ready. And I think that sentiment speaks to what it has always been in this country, for sure. Right?
There was another quote that kind of stuck out to me, like on this theme that we're talking about. And Cobb mentions that the willingness to engage in armed self-defense played an important role in the Southern freedom movement, for without it, terrorists would have killed far more people in the movement. And so it's how armed self-defense lived alongside the nonviolent movement to ensure the success, like of like the broader goal. Yeah. So
Sure.
I just thought that was really interesting. And it's just not something that people have talked about, but it makes so much sense at the same time.
For sure. One, group that I've heard in passing before, but I really never looked into was the Deacons of Defense and Justice. The author spent some time talking about this, and for our listeners, this was essentially an armed group of Black folks with like a self-defense group, and they had different chapters. And I think they started after, I want to say, the assassination of Malcolm X. It's kind of when they started to come into play. And so essentially these chapters the Deacons of Defense were created and established to just protect civil rights activists and their families that were threatened by, white supremacists, white vigilantes, etc. Which is pretty interesting, right? To see, like, we hear about folks like, Black Panther Party, etc., but how, these other offshoots were essentially doing the same thing and taking up arms to protect our communities after these tragic events were happening. And I think a part of that, because even when have been talking for the study to a lot of Black folks, one of the things they say is like, a lot of these politicians who want to take away guns are also protected by armed like bodyguards and folks like that. Like their families are protected by those same weapons that they want to take away from folks who don't have that same luxury. And so when I think of things like the Deacons of Defense, et cetera, I think it's a similar thing. Like it's just giving that added layer of protection to make folks feel safe and comfortable to practice whatever civil liberties they're trying to practice, or just do simple everyday tasks that I don't think we don't think about for folks who are more privileged and don't have to worry about that kind of day-to-day violence. And having these entities in place and created to be in place to say, hey, we're going to protect ourselves in this way. Again, not with the intent of going out and looking for trouble, just saying if trouble comes here, they will be ready.
Mm-hmm. Actually, as I was digging into some more stuff for, the Deacons for Defense, I actually found out that there was a 2003 movie made about it by Bill Duke, and it starred Forrest Whitaker.
Oh, wow. I'm going to check it out.
Yeah. So I don't know other platforms that it is on, but from what I found, there's like the full 90-minute version of it on YouTube, actually.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
Mm-hmm. And it's called Deacons for Defense. And the account that has it is called The Blackest Panther. So if anybody want to check out the movie, I probably will. For it to be by Bill Duke and have Forrest Whitaker, I'm pretty sure it's pretty good.
Oh yeah.
Movie.
Yeah, definitely those two names, legends in the field, to say the least.
Yeah. One thing that kind of stuck out for me, so you mentioned groups, but there was also a lot of discussion of the role that former soldiers have largely played in like pushing back against the oppression that Black people have faced. So, you think about World War II and Black veterans who had enjoyed, certain types of freedoms overseas, who had the experience, I think Cobb mentioned, of like actually using guns to kill white men, like in a different like context or country, and to come back home and it's just kind of like there's this like dissonance, like, no, we're not about to go back to how things were before.
Yeah.
And so there was this double V campaign calling for victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And veterans were a big part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a interesting take. And I want to say there was a movie, a Netflix movie, that Spike Lee joint. It talked about like it was like Black folks in Vietnam, like I don't know, it's called The Five Bloods or something like that.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And it covers similar, messaging and just like the plight of Black veterans going out, doing this for said country, coming back, being treated like nothing and worthless. And and not getting the same rights and still being severely oppressed. I think that does, especially with the training they have and the violence they've seen, I think it changes their perspective of how we should approach fighting for our civil liberties here, because essentially, they're going to other countries fighting for democracy, right, and civil liberties for this country, but don't even have it here. So I think it makes sense why they would come here and take up arms and be ready to protect, because they did it for their country, and of course they're going to do it for their family, their community, their loved ones, etc., even more so than you would do it for those folks. So yeah, I think and the interesting, with Black veterans, and I also think how it can relate to like law enforcement today as well. How many Black law enforcement officers feel similarly, like I go out, I protect and serve, and then, but this blue wall or Blue Lives Matter doesn't apply to me if I'm not in uniform. I feel like they probably similarly feel the same thing today about just how Black folks are treated, and Black police officers and white law enforcement officers are treated differently because of where we are. And I think it's not as I guess it's still an issue, but I'm saying not as the veterans, but more localized with law enforcement. I could see similar vibes and feelings being had between both parties.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Any other major takeaways, quotes, stories, anything that stuck out to you?
I just have one on the, I can't remember right now. It'll come back to me. But yes, I don't know if you have any other takeaways, Dav.
Well, I'll say thinking about some of the stories of just the way Black people kind of push back against authority. And so thinking about, there was at least one or two stories about, for instance, I think a farmer's farm was raided. And I think in one instance, the Black person was sitting on the porch with their rifle or whatever. And it was you can't be here. You don't have the authority. And even back in that day, I think in that case, the sheriff left. And I think there was another case where a farm was raided and the sheriff took the Black person's gun, and some of the young organizers talked about well, that's against, the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And that the farmer took the book that they referred to and went to the sheriff's office to be give me my gun back. And at first the sheriff was no, and then was no, this book right here says that I have a right to that gun, and how everybody was really worried, about, him coming back home. And then he came back, with the gun over his head, I think it was Mr. Joe, I won. Mm-hmm. And so just thinking about that pushing back on authority, using laws to their advantage, and it just pointing to the reason that knowledge is so dangerous, because it was only by weaponizing the law that they were able to have some of these victories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, for sure. And that had me think about one of the story I was thinking about. I can't remember the exact names, but it was because I know historically we hear about when somebody, a Black man typically, is accused of some kind of crime, whether it's with a white woman or a white victim, then oftentimes, especially during the lynching era, even if they were jailed, you would have these white mobs come in all the way to the prison or the jail, pull them out and lynch them before they can get, due process and have their day in court. And so there was one particular story where a man was accused of something, and the Black folks in the community knew that that he was probably going to be lynched. And so every day and every night, they until he was able to have his court case, they were surrounding the jail with firearms, protecting him. And so when white folks would come, they were like, "Listen, we do this, and they would pretty much retreat and not retreat from the smoke that was about to come their way, to just protect this one man so he can have his day in court and so he wouldn't be lynched, because they knew that what was coming. And why that story stands out to me is because we don't hear about those stories or that kind of resistance. We know about the lynching and the atrocities that took place, But also we don't hear about how many lynchings didn't happen because folks with firearms, Black folks with firearms, were protecting their own community members so that they can actually just have the law be applied fairly as well. So I was like, oh, that's just a really interesting story, because I think, and this is things we talked about historically in the past to Def, right? I think sometimes with the nonviolent approach, or sometimes when these stories aren't told, it takes away that empowerment factor from us. Like, oh no, we can actually stand up and fight and make sure this doesn't happen, instead of just being like victims, all these stories of us being victimized. But there are probably just as many stories of us, or how many people were saved because of bold folks like this taking up arms to protect our community members. That story really stood out to me, because it's like, wow, this just shows that, like, okay, we weren't always just, laying down and getting beat up and brutalized, that we were ready and ready to rock. And oftentimes we don't hear about those stories because probably nothing happened, because we were ready to fight back, or we had the weapons, so those atrocities didn't occur. So I can see why, even like today, right? If it bleeds, it leads. Those things make the headline. So in these stories where nothing actually occurred, we're not going to hear them in our history books as much.
Agreed. And that was, I feel like, a key point, particularly from those at the local level, like that understanding. And I think this was a direct quote, that like the night riders, the terrorists, as they were called, they took advantage of fear and weakness.
Mm-hmm.
And when they know that there's like somebody that is ready and willing to defend themselves, they think twice about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think all of this actually reminds me of a conversation I had with my granddad probably like 6 or 7 years ago, that really opened my eyes, because he was talking about growing up, like before, Brown v. Board of Education, before like segregation ended. And like, they used to be going back and forth with like white kids. So he talked about how one, you knew not to be caught by yourself. If you did, like, you might get beat up, you might get jumped, like people throwing rocks at you. But that he called him white boy. He was like, the white boys knew the same thing, because let one of them pass by, we throwing rocks, we throwing whatever. So there's this idea that like Black people were like cowering in fear, like that was the only mindset, when no, like there was a lot of back and forth. He told me about how, I don't know, something happened, like either like black person got beat up, like a Black boy, something happened, and the Black person like set the people's house on fire, like nobody got killed. Yeah. But like, and I mean, that person had to leave town forever for good, but it was just kind of like it was a lot going on that people don't talk about in terms of like the resistance that the not nonviolent resistance that Black people were doing at the time. So
that's for sure. And that's what we need. And I'm appreciating books like this. And there are a couple others for folks who might be interested as well that do. I think Negroes and the Gun is another one. And I think Second Amendment is another one. These are a couple other ones that I saw, and it's a whole bunch. It's another book called We Will Shoot Back. I have this whole list of books that I have to start sifting through, that also, these kind of historians take this approach and share these stories that, yes, you were fortunate to get from your grandfather, but a lot of folks probably don't get those kind of stories. Like, oh, we wasn't no punks, you know what I'm saying? We were willing and ready to at least make them worry a little bit before they came our way. And I think it's just empowering, especially when I think about the youth and now, starting a family and having my daughter, just the stories, what I want to make sure I include, because now I'm more aware of what I didn't get. And I need to include these stories as well. Like, listen, we fought back. Yes, these things did happen. Yes, these approaches did work when we talk about nonviolence, but also these other approaches worked as well. And you shouldn't be afraid to stand up for yourself, for your community, and thinking that only one strategy is the best strategy, because clearly it just wasn't the case at all.
Absolutely.
And one thing I like to do, one thing that kind of thing that was coming up in the book too, was just, just us as a Black community, we just have to also think about that too, just be understanding that, and I know we've had, some conversation about this over the past few years on the podcast, but, understanding that one approach isn't always the best approach, that when we are fighting this kind of war, if you will. It has to be won on multiple fronts. And so there was a lot of discord, throughout the book between folks who were trying to take within the Black community and NAACP and all these other things, right? Folks who were trying to take a more nonviolent approach and got really hesitant, or, push folks away who were saying like, no, we should take up arms, or we should be ready to go. And I think that's not the best strategy, because maybe not be fitting for you doesn't mean it's not going to work or be fitting in situations to help us get to where we need to be. I think that's something as a community we just need to keep reminding ourselves. It's like, hey, even though I may not feel fully comfortable holding this rifle, but maybe because you do, that still empowers us, right? And maybe by me marching and doing all that still empowers us too, and that we can be empowered in many different ways and many different dimensions. And we should all be, cognizant of that and accepting that we can all do this together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was one of my takeaways. We all got a role to play. Mm-hmm. Everybody doesn't have to do the same thing. And I feel like, Tyrell, this is a point that you and I underscore a lot. Mm-hmm. Everybody got a role. That's what I took from this.
Yeah.
And, respect those roles and think about how they work in complementary ways to achieve the overall purpose of, where we're trying to go.
For sure. 100%. So yeah, good read. Then I got the chance to sift through this. I'm working on this research and trying to get more into this field and this mindset. And it has me thinking differently about, like I said, I wasn't raised around guns or lived in a state that was comfortable with having guns. But it has definitely, talking to folks, reading this material has definitely begun to change my thoughts about owning. And yes, I own a firearm, and I've still never felt fully comfortable. Like I never wanted it. I just feel like I needed it. But also it's like, okay, this is actually, what makes me feel better is that, okay, this is actually a part of my history here, a part of my community, a part of my people. And I shouldn't feel bad or shouldn't feel wrong to taking up arms to, just protect me and mine. And I think that's why I said that empowerment point comes in, because even me at this stage of life now, I feel even more empowered to, or feel even more comfortable of doing what I'm doing, of taking up arms, because it's what we've always done, but I've never been told that before as much. So kudos to Charles E. Cobb for writing this book and the others and getting this conversation out there and started.
Absolutely. Thank you for recommending it. This is our first for real BHD book club discussion. Maybe in the future we can give y'all a heads up. Y'all can read it beforehand, and we can all be in conversation together around a topic.
Yeah, that'd actually be a good idea. So we can start doing that. But okay, we will catch up with y'all in a couple weeks for our end of the month current events episode. As we said, the new format. If you're not familiar with the new format, please go check out our welcome back episode that took place a couple weeks earlier, where we kind of break down, what we'll be doing moving forward. But we will essentially be bi-monthly, if you will, for the next few months till we figure out how we feel about this new strategy. So kind of book review, end of the month episode. So that'll be in a couple weeks where we kind of wrap up our thoughts on all the crazy and current events. And I know, just this summer alone was just too much to talk about. So I'm sure at the end of this month, we'll have a lot more to talk about. But if you haven't yet, please follow us on social media at BHD Podcast. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to keep all our latest content. You can email us, bhdpodcast@gmail.com. You have questions, comments, concerns, ideas, book ideas, let us know. We'll be glad to kind of check it out and maybe have that as one of our book review episodes. If you haven't yet, please review and rate us on iTunes, because that really helps us out with the algorithm. So please leave a comment, a nice review. If you haven't done that, you like what you hear, to help more people find us in that way. And after you do that, share us with your friends, share us with your family, share us with your enemies, and as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.
If you're interested in continuing this and other conversations, visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to subscribe to our email list, suggest topics, and participate in our discussion forums.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BHD Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite platform. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.